Sirens cut through the midnight silence of Route 460 like a blade through fabric, their sound traveling across the empty expanse of Virginia asphalt. Red and blue strobes painted the polished surface of a midnight blue 1968 Mustang in alternating waves of color. The kind of light that turns an ordinary night into something dangerous. The highway stretched in both directions like a forgotten road, the kind of place where people disappear without witnesses, where authority operates without scrutiny, where the night swallows everything except sound. 3 miles back, Officer Craig Hillson sat in his patrol cruiser, radio crackling with routine dispatch calls, the ambient noise of a late night that would soon become something far more consequential. Hillson was 34 years old, thick-necked and heavy-bodied, the kind of cop who carried himself with a permanent, tight-jawed scowl that he mistook for authority. His personnel file was thick, the kind of thickness that came from complaints that somehow never stuck, settlements that were paid quietly, investigations that mysteriously concluded without conviction. 14 excessive force complaints in 6 years, 9 of them involved minorities. All of them had been dismissed or settled by a union that protected its own the way a mother protects a troublesome child. To Officer Craig Hillson, the uniform was not a symbol of public service. It was a license. It was a shield that justified his worst impulses. That told him the badge gave him permission to see the world through a lens of suspicion and contempt. He had never faced real consequences for anything he had done. The union had always been there. His superiors had always looked the other way. The people he stopped, the people he harassed, the people he intimidated. They never fought back in ways that mattered. They were the kind of people who understood that fighting the system only made things worse. Hillson did not know it yet, but he was about to pull over the one person in Virginia who would not play that game. The Virginia night was cool and dark, the kind of darkness that exists only in places far from cities, where the sky above was filled with more stars than most people ever bothered to count. On Route 460, that darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no buildings, just the highway and the emptiness on either side of it. Commander David Reynolds drove at exactly 65 miles per hour in a 65-mile-per-hour zone, his hands resting lightly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel at the perfect 10 and 2 positions. The car he drove was his pride and his therapy. A midnight blue 1968 Ford Mustang that he had spent 3 years restoring with his own hands. Every piece of the engine had been touched by him. Every detail of the interior had been refined by his attention. The car was more than transportation. It was proof that he could build something beautiful and functional in a world that often demanded he be neither. David was 42 years old, a naval officer who had spent the last 20 years working in intelligence logistics. His job was classified in ways that required him to be careful about what he said, to whom he said it, when he said it. He commanded operations that involved the movement of sensitive information through contested spaces. He coordinated logistics for intelligence operations that touched 3 continents. He made decisions that affected the security of people he would never meet, people he would never know about. Tonight, he was not thinking about any of that. Tonight, he was thinking about his father. The memorial service had taken place that weekend. 4 days of driving to his father's hometown, of wearing a dark suit in a church he had not visited in 15 years, of listening to people talk about a man he had loved and understood and struggled with in equal measure. His father had been a man who fought his own battles with a system designed to fail him. His father had been a man who insisted on dignity even when the world told him dignity was not his to claim. His father had been a man who had taught David without ever saying it directly that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was almost certainly already lost. Now David was driving a classified operational brief to the Pentagon. The materials in his trunk were too sensitive for standard couriers, too classified for regular transport channels, too important to be sent through normal bureaucratic mechanisms. The Department of Defense had mandated specific security protocols for anyone transporting these kinds of materials. There were encrypted communication systems installed in the Mustang. There was a secondary electronic deadbolt on the trunk that could only be opened from inside the vehicle. And there were cameras. 4 high-definition cameras, positioned at the 12:36 and 9 o'clock positions around the exterior of the vehicle, recording everything in 4K resolution. The camera system had been installed 3 years ago, back when David first began this particular role. The military had required it, surveillance for the surveillance, accountability built into the very fabric of how he operated. The system was hardwired into an auxiliary battery that had its own independent power supply. It never turned off. It recorded continuously, creating a permanent record of everywhere David went and everything that happened around his vehicle. David did not think much about the cameras most of the time. They were simply part of his operational security, the same way that checking mirrors and maintaining awareness of his surroundings was part of his operational security. He had never needed them. In 5 years of transporting classified materials, no one had ever interfered with his vehicle or his mission. The cameras were insurance. They were protection against a scenario he had never believed would actually happen. Tonight, at 1 minute past midnight, those cameras were still recording. 3 miles away, Officer Craig Hillson spotted the Mustang approaching in the darkness. It was the kind of car that drew attention. Expensive, beautiful, clearly well-maintained. The kind of car that belonged in a showroom or on a collector's lot, not on a dark Virginia highway at midnight. Behind the wheel, illuminated by the ambient glow of the dashboard lights, was a black man. That was all it took. That was the entire calculus. Expensive car plus black driver plus midnight location equaled something that did not add up in Hillson's mind. When things did not add up, Hillson's instinct was always to investigate through aggression and suspicion. Hillson accelerated, closing the distance rapidly. He pulled alongside the Mustang for a few agonizing seconds, enough time to see the driver's face clearly, to understand the man's demeanor, to make the decision that had already been made the moment he saw the color of the driver's skin. The man did not look panicked. He did not look like someone who was doing something wrong. But Hillson did not care about those details. Hillson saw what he wanted to see. He dropped back behind the vehicle, swerved aggressively into the left lane as if he were about to pass, paced David's car for a few seconds, and then the light bar erupted into a blinding strobe of crimson and blue. In that moment, everything changed. The peaceful highway became a confrontation. The innocent drive became a stop. The night became dangerous. David sighed, not with panic, but with a kind of weary recognition. He had been stopped before. He had been profiled before. He understood the calculus of being a black man in America at midnight. He understood that this could go anywhere, that his entire night could be consumed by someone else's suspicion and someone else's authority. Most of all, he understood that he needed to survive this encounter intact. He signaled, smoothly guided the heavy American muscle car onto the gravel shoulder, shifted into park, turned off the engine, rolled down his window, turned on the dome light. Both hands he placed firmly on the steering wheel where they were clearly visible. This was protocol, the kind of protocol designed to keep him alive during a routine traffic stop. This was the protocol he had taught his teenage nephews, explaining to them in careful, specific terms what to do if they were ever pulled over. How to move without triggering fear. How to speak without triggering anger. He knew the rules. He knew how to play the game. He knew that staying calm was the first step toward walking away intact. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. Officer Craig Hillson swaggered up to the driver's side window, his hand already resting on the butt of his service weapon, an intimidation tactic he used as naturally as breathing. His face was flushed with an anger that had no real source beyond the fact that a man who looked like David was driving a car that Hillson thought he should not own. The confrontation began with light and sound. Hillson unclipped the retaining strap on his holster in a deliberate and aggressive gesture, letting David see the movement, letting the implications of that movement settle in the air between them. He leaned down to the window, shining his heavy 1,000-lumen tactical flashlight directly into David's eyes, the kind of light that makes it impossible to see. That creates disorientation, that establishes dominance through sensory control, license and registration. Now. Hillson's voice was sharp and dripping with an unearned authority. David had done this before. He had been trained to remain calm in tense situations. He had spent 20 years learning how to control his response to authority, to maintain composure when confronted with aggression, to think through the implications of every action. But the calculus was simple. He was going to give Hillson what Hillson wanted, because refusal would only escalate things in ways that could end badly for him. "Officer?" David said, his voice calm, resonant, and entirely steady. "My license is in my wallet in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Hillson's irritation intensified. The articulate response bothered him. The unbothered demeanor bothered him. The implicit refusal to panic or cower bothered him. Hillson was accustomed to people breaking down under the pressure of his authority, to people becoming deferential and fearful, to people treating him like he was someone to be afraid of. David's calmness was a rejection of that entire framework. I said, "Give me the damn papers, boy. Do not play games with me." The word hung in the cold night air like a physical object, heavy with history and meaning and contempt. It was a word chosen deliberately, a word designed to demean and dehumanize, a word that carried the weight of centuries of oppression and racial contempt. For just a moment, David's jaw tightened imperceptibly. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. But his discipline held firm. He had negotiated with hostile foreign delegates. He had commanded operations under extreme pressure. He had stared down people who represented genuine threats to his life and his mission. A small-town racist with a badge and a uniform was not going to break his composure. Moving my hand to my back pocket for the license. David narrated calmly, retrieving the leather bifold from his pocket and extracting his Virginia driver's license. He handed it through the window. Now, reaching into the glove compartment. He opened the glove compartment with his free hand and withdrew the registration documents, handing those through as well. Hillson snatched the documents with aggressive movements, retreating a few steps to shine his flashlight on the cards. He scrutinized the name on the license. David Reynolds. He looked back at the Mustang gleaming in the red and blue strobe light. Then he looked back at David. His mind was already moving down a path of suspicion that had nothing to do with how David was driving. Nice car. Hillson muttered, his tone loaded with something between admiration and contempt. "Whose is it?" "Mine," David replied evenly. "Right." Hillson scoffed, stepping back up to the door. "A guy like you driving a fully restored '68 Mustang. Tell me, Reynolds, where exactly did you steal this from? Because we both know you cannot afford a $50,000 classic on whatever hustle you are running." The logic was instantaneous and racist. The assumption was automatic. Because David was black and the car was expensive, the car must be stolen. There was no other explanation in Hillson's mind. The registration could be forged. The insurance could be fake. The documentation could all be lies because people like David did not own cars like this. They could not. It was not possible within Hillson's understanding of how the world worked. "The registration is in my name, officer, as is the insurance." David said, his eyes locking onto Hillson's. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Hillson knew the truth. He had not pulled David over because of any traffic violation. He had pulled David over because of the color of his skin and the quality of his car. But Hillson was practiced at lying. He had been doing it for years. He had been lying to himself about his own motivations for years. Lying to others about what he had observed during traffic stops was something he had perfected into an art form. "You were swerving," Hillson said without hesitation, the lie emerging from his mouth as if it were absolute truth. "Failure to maintain a lane. Step out of the vehicle." David knew the lie when he heard it. He had been driving perfectly straight. He had been maintaining his lane with precision. He had been operating his vehicle exactly according to traffic laws and regulations. But he also understood that being right did not matter in this situation. Being right did not keep you alive on dark highways at midnight. "I was not swerving," David stated, not raising his voice, maintaining his composure. "I was driving the speed limit and maintaining my lane. I gave you a lawful order." Hillson barked his hand, dropping to the grip of his service weapon. "Step out of the damn car." The implications were clear. The consequences were implicit. This was the moment when the interaction could escalate into something physical, something dangerous, something with potentially lethal outcomes. David understood that being right did not matter in that calculus. Being alive mattered. Being able to walk away intact mattered. Everything else was secondary. With slow, deliberate movements, he opened the door and stepped out into the chill night air. At 6 feet 2 inches, with the broad-shouldered build of a man who spent 2 hours in the gym every morning, David easily towered over the stocky, red-faced officer standing in front of him. That physical difference made Hillson feel small. When Hillson felt small, he compensated through aggression. He shoved David hard against the side of the Mustang, the impact enough to knock the air from his lungs momentarily. "Spread them," Hillson yelled, kicking David's feet apart with excessive force. "Hands on the roof." David's hands went to the roof of his car. He could feel the warmth of the metal still radiating from the engine heat. He could feel the rough texture of the paint against his palms. He could feel Hillson's presence immediately behind him. He could sense the violence that was barely contained beneath the officer's uniform. "You got any weapons on you?" Hillson demanded, beginning a rough and invasive pat-down that was far more aggressive than any legitimate search. "Needles. Anything that is going to stick me." "I am unarmed," David said, his face pressed against the cool metal of his car. "I have no contraband." Hillson yanked David's wallet from his back pocket and tossed it onto the trunk of the car with a gesture of contempt. Then, moving toward the driver's side door, Hillson announced, "I am searching your vehicle." "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," David said, clearly turning his head just enough to make eye contact. "You have no probable cause." Hillson stopped, a nasty grin spreading across his face. He had heard this line before. He had heard people claim their Fourth Amendment rights before. He had spent the last 10 years learning how to circumvent those rights through lies and fabrications and claims of probable cause that were completely invented, but that had always held up in his precinct's internal investigations. Probable cause. Hillson laughed, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "I smell marijuana." "That gives me all the cause I need." "That is a lie." "That is," David replied, his voice dropping an octave, radiating the kind of cold authority that came from 2 decades of commanding operations and directing people in high-stress situations. "There are no drugs in this car. Do not open my trunk. I have sensitive work materials secured in the rear compartment." "Oh, sensitive work materials." Hillson laughed, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Is that what you thugs are calling your supply nowadays? Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. You are under arrest. For what charge?" David asked, his voice still measured, still controlled. "Resisting arrest and obstructing a police investigation," Hillson said triumphantly, as if he had just delivered checkmate in a game of chess. He grabbed David's wrists, ratcheting the metal cuffs down painfully tight, ignoring the standard safety gaps that were supposed to prevent circulation problems. David did not struggle. He understood that struggling would only give Hillson more justification for violence, more reason to escalate. So he allowed himself to be manhandled into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. His wrists aching, the metal cuffs cutting into the soft tissue of his inner wrists. As the cruiser pulled away from the shoulder of Route 460, David sat in the darkness of the back seat and watched as Hillson aggressively rifled through the cabin of his beloved Mustang, tossing papers and personal items around with careless abandon, searching for drugs that did not exist, looking for evidence of crimes that had never been committed. When Hillson moved to the trunk, he found it firmly locked with a secondary electronic deadbolt that David had installed for exactly this purpose, to protect the classified materials inside from unauthorized access. Unable to open it, Hillson cursed, slammed the trunk lid, and stalked back to the cruiser, his face flushed with frustration at his inability to continue his search. But Hillson did not know something crucial. He did not understand that while he had been searching the Mustang's interior with careless disregard, the 4 high-definition cameras mounted on the exterior of the vehicle had been recording everything. 4 cameras in 4 directions, 360-degree coverage, 4K resolution, crystal clear audio capturing every word, every insult, every fabrication. The system was hardwired into an auxiliary battery that would continue recording long after the car stopped moving, long after David was processed and detained, long after Hillson had convinced himself that he had done nothing wrong. Everything was captured. The moment Hillson had swerved behind the Mustang, the moment he had pulled alongside to look at David's face, the moment he had decided that this man driving this car in this jurisdiction at this time was someone worth stopping, the moment he had used the word boy, the moment he had fabricated the traffic violation, the moment he had invented the probable cause, the moment he had arrested a man for crimes that had never been committed. All of it was preserved in video and audio, a permanent record of Hillson's conduct and prejudice and abuse of authority. As the cruiser pulled away from the highway and moved toward town, David sat in the back seat, his wrists aching from the cuffs. His mind was already working through the implications of what had happened and what would come next. He was not thinking about his pain. He was not thinking about the injustice of the arrest. He was not thinking about his beloved Mustang now abandoned on the side of the highway. He was thinking about the exact sequence of phone calls he was going to make. The Oak Creek Police Department precinct was located in a bleak cinderblock building that smelled of old coffee and institutional indifference. The walls were painted a shade of beige that had probably been chosen decades ago as some kind of neutral canvas, but which now just looked tired and worn. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly glow over everything below them. The building had the feel of a place where the rules mattered less than authority, where process was secondary to power, where the badge was treated as a license rather than a responsibility. David was processed like any other arrest. Fingerprints, photographs, a search of his person that documented his belongings and removed his dignity piece by piece. He was placed in a holding cell, a small concrete room with a metal bench and a toilet and nothing else. A room designed to be uncomfortable, to encourage compliance, to break down the will of the people placed inside it. The interrogation happened in a small room with two-way glass, the kind of room that David had seen in countless training videos about police procedures and civilian rights. Officer Brady sat across from him, a young man probably in his late 20s, someone who still had the naive belief that his job was about helping people and protecting communities. Brady had been given a simple directive. Get David to break. Get David to admit to something. Get David to accept responsibility for the fabricated charges. So, Brady said, opening a file in front of him and settling into the chair with an air of rehearsed authority. Let us talk about the drag racing. There was no drag racing, David said calmly. Officer Hillson says, Brady began. Officer Hillson is lying. David interrupted, his voice level and precise. I was driving at the speed limit. I was maintaining my lane. I did not resist arrest. I have committed no crime. The interrogation continued in this pattern. Brady would make assertions. David would calmly refute them. Brady would try to suggest that cooperation would lead to better outcomes. David would repeat his requests for legal counsel and a phone call. Brady would grow increasingly frustrated as David refused to break, refused to panic, refused to accept the narrative that Hillson was constructing. David had been trained in this. Compartmentalization was something they taught military officers. Patience was something they taught commanders. The knowledge that showing emotion was weakness. That was something David had learned a long time ago. Behind the two-way glass, Hillson watched with satisfaction. He was convinced that he had won. The arrest was made. The paperwork was being filed. The system would take its course. By the time it was all over, David would have a criminal record that would define the rest of his life. Hillson had done this before. This was his arena. This was where his power was absolute. Finally, after nearly 4 hours in the interrogation room, David was allowed his phone call. He did not call a lawyer. He did not call a friend or family member. Instead, he called a man identified only as Richard, a military liaison, a contact with access to levels of authority that small-town police departments could not even comprehend. The conversation was brief and coded. The kind of conversation designed to communicate maximum information with minimum exposition. David explained the situation. He used specific terminology. He activated protocols that had been established years ago for exactly this scenario, a situation where federal materials were at risk, where federal operations were compromised, where federal jurisdiction became relevant. Command, this is Reynolds. David said into the phone, his voice measured and precise. Code 7 Echo. Federal material compromised. Oak Creek Precinct, Route 460 approach. Suspect is local LEO with prior civil rights violations. I am in custody. Initiate Protocol Delta. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and immediate. The voice of someone accustomed to making rapid decisions with significant consequences. Understood, Commander. NCIS and FBI mobile units are en route. ETA 18 minutes. Secure location. Do not provide statements. 18 minutes. That was all it would take for everything to change. The first indication that something was wrong came when Officer Brady received an urgent phone call. His face went pale as he listened to information he did not fully understand. Words and acronyms and implications that made the small police precinct in Oak Creek suddenly seem very, very small. He immediately went to find Hillson, who was in a back office, writing his report with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Hillson. Brady said, his voice trembling slightly. There is a situation. Federal agents are inbound. Something about classified materials and national security protocols. Hillson's confidence remained completely unshaken. He had the badge. He had the arrest paperwork. He had done everything according to procedure, or at least according to his understanding of what procedure meant. The federal government did not matter. Not here. Not in his precinct. Then the precinct doors exploded open, and everything changed in the span of seconds. Federal agents in tactical gear poured through, men and women in dark uniforms with FBI emblems clearly visible, moving with the efficiency of people trained in rapid response, moving with the authority of people who operated at a level far above local law enforcement. Special Agent Richard Donovan, NCIS Director, entered with a cold, clinical composure that immediately dominated every space he occupied. His presence alone shifted the balance of power. His expression alone communicated that something catastrophic had occurred. Donovan's eyes found Hillson. His gaze was the kind of gaze that could freeze blood in veins. You are holding federal personnel. Donovan said, his voice carrying no anger, only cold statement of fact. You are interfering with classified operations. You are about to be arrested for deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent. Hillson's face flushed red. His confidence, so absolute just moments before, began to crack. He tried to defend himself, to explain, to assert his authority. He resisted arrest. He refused a search. He was driving erratically. Donovan cut him off with a single raised hand and a gesture so authoritative that it silenced the entire room. Disarm that man, now. 2 FBI tactical agents moved with terrifying speed, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from thousands of hours of training and dozens of operations conducted across the globe. Before Hillson could even process the command, could even understand what was happening to him, he was slammed face first onto the booking desk with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. His duty belt was unclipped and stripped away. Weapon, cuffs, badge, all removed in the span of 30 seconds. He was a police officer being arrested by federal agents in his own precinct. The psychological reversal was immediate and complete. "Hey, you cannot do this!" Hillson screamed, his cheek pressed painfully against the laminated surface of the desk. "I am a sworn police officer." "You are a local liability who just triggered a national security crisis," Donovan replied coldly, stepping away to allow the agents to secure Hillson's wrists with federal handcuffs that looked more serious, more permanent, more real than any local restraints. The back door flew open and Chief Thomas Harrigan stumbled in, his uniform shirt half-buttoned, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. He took one look at the heavily armed federal agents occupying his precinct and the NCIS director standing in front of his desk. His face went pale. He looked like he was going to vomit. The precinct he had managed for 15 years. The precinct he had thought he understood. The precinct he had believed was under his control. It had just been invaded by the federal government. Nothing would ever be the same. "I am Chief Harrigan," he wheezed, holding his hands up in a gesture of compliance. "What in God's name is happening here?" Donovan turned to the chief with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "Chief Harrigan, I am Special Agent Donovan, NCIS. With me is Supervisory Special Agent Miller of the FBI. We are here to secure the release of Commander David Reynolds and to initiate a federal inquiry into your department." Brady scrambled forward with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally unlocking the heavy cuffs binding David to the holding cell bench. David stood up, rubbing his wrists where the metal had cut into his skin. He adjusted his hoodie with movements that were deliberate and calm, his demeanor still entirely unruffled despite everything he had endured. "Thank you, Sergeant," David said, his voice carrying a note of respect for the young officer who had at least had the decency to look uncomfortable during the interrogation. "Commander, are you all right?" Donovan asked, his tone shifting to one of deep professional respect. "I am fine, Richard," David said. "What is the status of my vehicle?" "A joint military police and federal tactical unit secured your Mustang on Route 460 10 minutes ago," Donovan reported loudly, ensuring that everyone in the room heard him, ensuring that everyone understood the magnitude of what was happening. "The vehicle is intact. The secure Pelican case in the trunk was untouched." Donovan turned back to Chief Harrigan, who was actively sweating through his shirt. "Chief, do you have any idea what your officer pulled over tonight? Commander Reynolds is a primary logistics coordinator for Fleet Forces Command. The locked trunk your officer attempted to pry open contained classified operational drives meant for a Joint Chiefs intelligence briefing at the Pentagon in 6 hours. If Officer Hillson had breached that trunk, we would not be having a conversation. He would be in federal custody facing espionage-level charges." The weight of those words settled over the precinct like a heavy blanket. An espionage charge, a national security violation, a breach of classified operations. This was not about a traffic stop anymore. This was not about a single officer's misconduct anymore. This was about federal jurisdiction, federal authority, federal consequences. Harrigan glared at Hillson, who was now standing against the wall, disarmed and pale as a ghost, looking nothing like the confident predator who had pulled over the Mustang a few hours earlier. "Hillson, what did you do?" Harrigan asked, his voice carrying absolute disgust. "He was swerving, Chief. I swear," Hillson pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "And I smelled marijuana. I was just doing my job." He pointed a trembling finger at David. "He is a drug dealer. Look at him. He is lying to you." David slowly walked up to the booking desk. The room fell completely dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the barely perceptible sound of breathing from the officers who understood that they were witnessing the end of something. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely worse than anger. Disappointment carried judgment. Disappointment suggested that Hillson had failed to live up to some basic standard of decency. "Officer Hillson." David said, his voice echoing in the quiet room with the kind of authority that came from years of commanding people in high-pressure situations. "You pulled me over because I'm a black man driving an expensive classic car in your jurisdiction at midnight. You profiled me when I did not cower, when I did not show the fear you expected. Your ego felt threatened. You fabricated a traffic violation. You fabricated probable cause. And you fabricated a resisting charge. All of it is documented. All of it is recorded. All of it is undeniable." Hillson's breathing became shallow. "You cannot prove any of that. It is your word against mine. I have the badge." David smiled then, not with anger, but with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you hold the absolute winning hand in a confrontation. "Not anymore, you do not." An FBI special agent stepped forward, dropping a thick manila folder onto the booking desk with a gesture that was almost gentle. "Officer Craig Hillson, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, has been quietly building a file on you for 18 months. We have a dozen complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful searches. Your local union managed to bury them here, but they could not bury them federally." The folder landed like a bomb. Inside were 18 months of documentation, 18 months of investigation, 18 months of evidence gathering that had been happening while Hillson went about his daily business, believing himself invincible, believing that the union would protect him, believing that no one would ever hold him accountable for anything. As for tonight, David added, his voice relentless and precise. "My 1968 Mustang is heavily modified due to the nature of the classified materials I occasionally transport. The Department of Defense required me to install a 360-degree 4K internal and external dash cam system. It is hardwired into an auxiliary battery. It does not turn off." Hillson's face went even paler, if that was possible. The blood drained from his head, leaving him looking like a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. "The system records audio and video." David continued, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "It recorded me driving perfectly straight at exactly 65 miles per hour. It recorded you swerving behind me. It recorded your aggressive approach. It recorded your use of the word boy. It recorded your immediate demand to know where I stole the vehicle. It recorded your entirely fabricated claim of smelling narcotics to bypass my Fourth Amendment rights." Every word was a nail in Hillson's coffin. Every statement was backed by evidence that Hillson could not deny, could not refute, could not escape from. The dashboard footage showed everything: Hillson's face, his expressions, the aggression in his movements, the deliberate nature of his approach. The audio was crystal clear, impossible to deny or distort. The racial slur was captured perfectly, preserved in perpetuity, damning in its clarity. "Chief Harrigan," the FBI agent said, tapping the folder with deliberate slowness, We will be seizing all of your precinct server's body cam footage and dispatch logs. Officer Hillson is under federal arrest for the deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and tampering with a federal officer. Chief Harrigan did not argue. He did not try to protect his man. He looked at Hillson with utter disgust, not the disgust of a man defending his subordinate, but the disgust of a man who suddenly understood the magnitude of the liability standing in front of him. "Take him," Harrigan said, his voice hollow and defeated. "I want him out of my precinct." 2 FBI agents grabbed Hillson by the arms. The bully who had swaggered through the streets of Oak Creek for a decade, terrorizing those he thought could not fight back, was suddenly a whimpering, broken man. As they snapped the federal handcuffs onto his wrists, pulling them tight with the kind of efficiency that came from routine practice, Hillson looked back at David, his eyes wide with terror and regret. "Please." Hillson choked out his voice, barely recognizable as human. "Please, man. I have a family. I will lose my pension. I will lose everything." David looked at him, his expression cold and unyielding, his voice carrying the weight of everything Hillson had done and everything it meant. "You should have thought about your family before you decided to play God on Route 460. You targeted the wrong man tonight, Hillson. Actions have consequences. Your watch is over." Hillson broke down sobbing uncontrollably as the federal agents dragged him toward the exit, his boots scraping pathetically against the linoleum floor. The sound of his crying echoed through the precinct, mixing with the sound of doors opening and closing, with the sound of federal authority asserting itself over local power structures, with the sound of accountability finally arriving in a place where it had been absent for far too long. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing Hillson's fate. Chief Harrigan cleared his throat, looking at David with an expression that mixed profound apology with absolute terror about what was coming next for his department. "Commander Reynolds, I do not know what to say. On behalf of this department, I am deeply, deeply sorry. Save the apology for the community your department has been failing, Chief," David said firmly. "I suggest you take a very close look at the rest of your roster before the DOJ does it for you." David turned to Agent Donovan. "Richard, if my vehicle is secure, I would like to get on the road. I still have a briefing to make. We have an armed escort waiting outside for you, Commander," Donovan said with a respectful nod. "We will clear the highway all the way to D.C. The rest of this mess belongs to the Bureau now." David walked out of the Oak Creek precinct, stepping into the cool Virginia night air. A line of black federal SUVs sat idling outside the building, their lights cutting through the darkness in parallel lines that suggested power and authority and the inevitable progression of consequence. In the center of the motorcade was his midnight blue Mustang, exactly as he had left it, untouched, secure, protected. A young military police officer standing guard by the driver's door snapped to a crisp salute as David approached. David returned the salute. A recognition of protocol and respect between people who understood the meaning of rank and responsibility. He slid into the driver's seat, fired up the massive V8 engine, felt the familiar vibration of the car around him. This was his sanctuary. This was his escape. This was his way of reclaiming something that Hillson had tried to take. But before he could drive away, David sat in silence for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his head bowed slightly. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the memorial service that had taken place just 4 days earlier. He was thinking about a man who had fought his own battles with a system designed to fail him, who had insisted on dignity even when the world told him dignity was not his to claim. He was thinking about the ways that history repeats itself, the ways that systems perpetuate themselves, the ways that power protects power unless someone is willing to stand up and refuse. David understood that his refusal to be intimidated, his refusal to accept lies, his understanding of his rights, his knowledge that he had protection through the federal system. All of these things combined had created something larger than just his personal justice. He understood that his actions tonight, his decision to call the federal liaison, his decision to refuse to cooperate with fabricated charges, had triggered an investigation into the Oak Creek Police Department that would extend far beyond Officer Craig Hillson. Within hours, the story broke across Virginia media outlets. Navy officer released from custody after federal intervention and local traffic stop. Then came more. Federal investigation launched into Virginia Police Department's conduct. And finally, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opens inquiry into pattern of misconduct. The federal investigators, now authorized to fully examine the Oak Creek Precinct's records, began pulling documentation that painted a far more damning picture than anyone had anticipated. They found evidence not just of Hillson's individual misconduct, but of a pattern that extended across multiple officers. They found evidence of targeting specific neighborhoods for increased enforcement. They found evidence of stops conducted without proper justification, of searches conducted without proper authority, of arrests conducted for the purpose of generating revenue through municipal fines and court costs. What they discovered was an entire department operating under assumptions of immunity, protected by a union that had been too successful in its protection of officers, enabled by a chief who had looked the other way when he should have looked directly at the problem. Other victims came forward, not just people stopped by Hillson, but people stopped by other officers as well. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The precinct's culture of impunity was exposed with surgical precision by federal investigators who had no interest in protecting local authority or maintaining professional courtesy. Officers who had believed themselves protected by the Union suddenly realized that federal jurisdiction did not respect local agreements. Officers who had thought their conduct was acceptable within their own departmental structure suddenly understood that federal law had different standards, different requirements, different consequences. 2 officers submitted their resignations within 48 hours. 1 officer requested an immediate transfer to a different jurisdiction. Others began scrambling to find legal representation, understanding that the federal government's attention would extend beyond just Hillson, that the shield that had protected them for so long was no longer impenetrable. Chief Harrigan, recognizing the existential threat to his career and his reputation, called a mandatory precinct meeting. He made it clear that the federal government was coming, that investigations were expanding, that anyone with problematic histories should consider their options while they still had the power to choose what happened next. The message was implicit but clear. Resign now, or face federal investigation and potential prosecution. 3 officers resigned within the next week. Federal investigators returning to their command center understood the scope of what they had uncovered. This was not about one bad apple. This was about an institutional culture that had permitted and encouraged misconduct, that had protected officers from accountability, that had treated the badge as a license for abuse rather than as a symbol of public service. They met with David one final time, after he had delivered his classified briefing to the Pentagon, after he had completed the operational requirement that had been the original purpose of his midnight drive on Route 460. "Commander," the lead investigator said, "we have completed our preliminary examination of the Oak Creek Precinct's records. What we have found extends far beyond Officer Hillson's individual conduct. We are looking at what appears to be a departmental approach to enforcement that disproportionately targets certain neighborhoods and certain communities." David listened without interrupting, understanding the implications, understanding the magnitude of what the federal government was about to undertake. "We would like to know whether you want to participate in the prosecution," the investigator continued. "Whether you want to press additional charges, whether you want to pursue civil litigation, whether you want to be part of the public case. We can move forward either way, but we wanted to give you the choice." David's answer was measured and clear. Whatever supports the investigation and protects the community going forward. This is not about my personal justice anymore. It is about whether we can create structural change that prevents this from happening to someone else. The investigators understood immediately that they were dealing with a commander's mindset, not a victim's mindset. David's concern was not with his personal vindication, but with the implications of what had happened and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. He agreed to cooperate fully with the federal prosecution. He agreed to provide testimony. He agreed to make the classified briefing situation public if it meant strengthening the case. He understood that his decision to refuse to accept the lies Hillson had constructed, combined with the documentation provided by the dash cam system, had created the conditions for accountability on a scale that extended far beyond one traffic stop. The federal case against Officer Craig Hillson moved through the court system with the weight of the entire federal government behind it. The charges were multiple and serious: deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, tampering with a federal officer. The dash cam footage was introduced as evidence, played in court for the judge to review in its entirety. Crystal clear, damning, undeniable. Hillson's face appeared on the screen, his expressions captured in perfect detail. The moment of suspicion when he had pulled alongside the Mustang to look at David's face. The moment of decision when he had determined that the expensive car and the black driver were incompatible in his mind. The moment of fabrication when he had invented the traffic violation. The moment of aggression when he had shoved David against the car. The moment of racial contempt when he had used the word boy. All of it was there, preserved in video and audio, impossible to deny or distort or reinterpret. The defense had no viable strategy. There was no argument that could overcome the documentary evidence. There was no legal principle that could protect Hillson from the implications of what the recording showed. The DOJ presented 18 months of investigation. The pattern of misconduct became undeniable. 12 prior complaints, 8 documented instances of racial profiling, 3 settlements that had been negotiated by the union to make cases disappear. All of it was presented methodically, factually, devastating in its accumulation of evidence. Witnesses testified. Other drivers whom Hillson had pulled over under similar pretexts. Other victims who had experienced his abuse of authority. Each testimony reinforced the pattern. Each story underlined the systematic nature of the misconduct. Hillson's attorney made a motion to suppress the dash cam evidence on the grounds that it had been obtained without authorization, that the recording device violated the privacy of the officer conducting the stop. The motion was denied. The judge ruled that a federal officer transporting classified materials had legitimate security requirements that superseded local privacy concerns. The evidence would be admitted. Faced with the overwhelming documentary evidence, faced with the testimony of multiple victims, faced with the 18 months of federal investigation, Hillson's attorney had only one realistic option: negotiate a plea deal. Guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law in exchange for reduced charges on the false imprisonment and tampering charges. Federal prison time would be inevitable, but cooperation might minimize the sentence. Hillson agreed to the plea deal. There was nothing else he could do. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray morning in federal court. The kind of morning that suggested the weight of consequence. The kind of morning when the machinery of accountability finally caught up with someone who had believed himself beyond its reach. Hillson sat at the defense table, his uniform replaced with civilian clothes, his badge no longer present, stripped of the external symbols that had granted him authority and power. He looked diminished. He looked broken. He looked like someone who had finally understood the magnitude of what he had done and what it meant. The federal judge reviewed the evidence carefully, methodically, making it clear that she understood not just what Hillson had done, but why he had done it. What motivations had driven him to abuse his authority in the ways he had? Officer Hillson. The judge said, her voice carrying absolute clarity. You took an oath to protect and serve the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. You violated that oath through a series of calculated actions designed to abuse a citizen on the basis of his race. You lied in your police report. You fabricated evidence. You violated the Fourth Amendment rights of a federal officer while attempting to compromise classified national security materials. You abused the authority granted to you by the public trust. The judge paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. You are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for deprivation of rights under color of law, to be served concurrently with an additional 3 years for false imprisonment. Your pension is forfeited and will be liquidated to pay restitution to your victim. You are permanently prohibited from holding any law enforcement position in any jurisdiction. You are sentenced to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to begin immediately. Hillson's face crumbled. His future had just been defined. 5 years in federal prison, a lifetime as a convicted felon. No pension, no career, no possibility of redemption within the system that had protected him for so long. As officers escorted him from the courtroom, his eyes met David's for just a moment. There was terror there. There was regret. There was the sudden devastating realization that the badge had provided no actual protection, that power could be challenged, that lies could be exposed, that accountability could arrive despite every effort to prevent it. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind him, and Officer Craig Hillson's career in law enforcement came to an absolute end. Over the following months, the Oak Creek Police Department underwent a transformation mandated by federal oversight. The federal government, having investigated the department and discovered the pattern of misconduct, made it clear that structural reform was non-negotiable. New hiring protocols were implemented with an emphasis on community relationship and de-escalation training rather than enforcement metrics and productivity quotas. Training programs were revised to emphasize accountability and constitutional compliance. The use of physical force was restricted and documented more carefully. The practice of racial profiling was explicitly prohibited in writing, with specific consequences for violations. A civilian review board was established with subpoena power and the authority to investigate complaints independently of the police department's internal affairs process. The board's findings became public, no longer buried in departmental files or settled quietly through union negotiations. Every complaint was documented. Every pattern was visible to the community being served. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers on duty, with footage released within 72 hours unless there was a specific ongoing investigation that required confidentiality. The days of footage disappearing or being corrupted or being unavailable when questions were raised, those days were over. Federal oversight remained in place, not as temporary punishment, but as a permanent structural change. Quarterly reviews of department procedures, annual audits of enforcement patterns, regular assessments of whether the department was operating in compliance with federal civil rights standards. The message sent by the federal government was unmistakable. This department will be different going forward. The police officers who remained understood that they were no longer operating in a space where misconduct could be concealed. They were operating under the watchful eye of the federal government, knowing that their conduct would be scrutinized, knowing that accountability was no longer optional. Chief Harrigan submitted his resignation 4 months after Hillson's sentencing, choosing to leave on his own terms rather than face further federal investigation into his role in enabling the misconduct. He was replaced by a chief recruited from outside the department, someone without a history of looking the other way when officers abused their authority, someone committed to rebuilding the department's relationship with the community it served. Several months later, the same gas station where David had considered stopping for supplies during his midnight drive was quiet and ordinary, the kind of place that existed on the margins of people's consciousness, noticed only when you needed something from it. David pulled into the lot at midday, filling his Mustang's tank with the kind of deliberate movements that had become habit. A patrol car pulled into the lot, a different one than Hillson had driven, a different officer inside. A younger man with the demeanor of someone actually trained in community policing rather than aggressive enforcement. The officer noticed David, recognized the Mustang as something notable, and approached with respect rather than aggression. Seeing that it was David, the officer simply waved and continued with his patrol, not approaching confrontationally, not making assumptions, not treating David as a target or a problem to be solved. The interaction was unremarkable. It was peaceful. It was exactly what a traffic stop should be. David reflected on this moment as he drove away from the gas station. He reflected on what had happened in the months since that midnight pullover. He reflected on the fact that the system that had produced Hillson, the precinct that had protected him, the institutional structure that had permitted his abuse of authority, that system had been forced to change. It was not perfect. Institutional racism in law enforcement persisted in countless communities across the country. Misconduct still happened. Officers still abused their authority. But the structure of accountability had changed. The mechanisms of protection had been dismantled. The shield that had protected Hillson and officers like him had been punctured and weakened. The dashboard cameras were mandatory now. The civilian review board had teeth. The federal oversight was permanent. The message had been sent to every officer in the department. The badge is not a license for impunity. The uniform does not grant you immunity from the law. Misconduct will be documented, exposed, and prosecuted. For David, the story had personal meaning beyond the implications. His father had passed away. The inheritance he had received was not material wealth, but the knowledge that refusing to accept injustice silently could create space for accountability. His father had fought his own battles with systems designed to fail him. Now David had fought one too. His refusal to back down, his understanding of his rights, his access to federal protection through his military position. All of these things combined had created change that would protect others going forward. The Navy recognized his conduct with a commendation, not for fighting back, not for confronting Hillson in any physical sense, but for his discipline, for his knowledge of his rights, for his refusal to panic or escalate even when he had every reason to fear for his safety. His military career continued, though his assignment changed slightly due to the public attention surrounding the case. He took extended leave to process his father's death, to grieve in ways he could not during the federal investigation, to reflect on everything that had transpired. He did not become an activist or a spokesperson for police reform. That was not his role, but he understood that his actions, by insisting on accountability, by refusing to accept lies, by documenting everything and trusting the federal system to work, his actions had created space for change. He understood that the next person pulled over by an officer in Oak Creek now had a better chance of justice, a better chance of being believed, a better chance of their rights being protected. The Mustang, rebuilt with David's own hands, became a symbol of something larger than one traffic stop. It represented the idea that power can be challenged when exercised unlawfully, that documentation matters, that federal oversight can create accountability when local systems fail. The story resonated with audiences who understood a fundamental truth. The system was designed to protect itself, to protect authority, to protect those with power. But the system could be changed. The system could be challenged. Accountability, when pursued relentlessly and documented thoroughly, could create lasting structural change. David's composure throughout the ordeal, his refusal to panic, his knowledge of his rights, his military discipline, his understanding of federal jurisdiction, became a model for how to survive and ultimately prevail against abuse of authority. The dash cam footage. the federal investigation, the court proceedings, the sentencing. These were the mechanisms through which accountability happened in a system designed to protect itself until it could not anymore. Officer Craig Hillson was now serving a 5-year federal prison sentence. He had lost his pension. He had lost his career. He had lost the shield that had protected him. He had become a cautionary tale about what happens when someone abuses authority against the wrong person, against someone who knows his rights, against someone with access to federal protection. The Oak Creek Police Department operated under new protocols that made misconduct harder to hide and easier to expose. Other departments across Virginia began implementing similar reforms. The federal government used the case as a template for civil rights enforcement in other jurisdictions. The message to officers everywhere was clear. The badge is not a license for impunity. Abuse of authority will be investigated. Lies will be exposed. Misconduct will be prosecuted. The era of local unions protecting officers from federal accountability was ending. The message to victims was equally clear. Accountability mechanisms exist. Documentation matters. Federal resources can be mobilized. You do not have to accept abuse silently. You can fight back. Systems that have been designed to fail you for centuries can, if pushed hard enough, be forced to change. As David pulled out onto the highway that evening, the same highway where everything had begun months earlier, he was not thinking about victory or vindication or personal triumph. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about the memorial service. He was thinking about a man who had fought his own battles with systems designed to fail him. He was thinking about the ways that his refusal to accept injustice silently had created consequences that extended far beyond his own situation. The roar of the Mustang's 5.8 engine shattered the evening silence as David accelerated, flanked by the natural traffic of the Virginia highway, leaving behind a police department that had been transformed by federal oversight and a predator who had finally been held accountable. It was not a perfect ending. Institutional racism in law enforcement persisted in countless communities. Misconduct continued to happen. But the infrastructure of accountability had been established. The federal government had created a precedent. The Civilian Review Board had been given power. The body cameras recorded everything. What happened on Route 460 that midnight? The traffic stop, the fabrication, the arrest, the federal intervention, the prosecution, the sentencing. It was proof that accountability was possible. It was proof that power could be challenged. It was proof that truth could be documented and preserved and used in court to destroy lies and expose misconduct. David understood now that his actions, his refusal to be intimidated, his decision to call his federal liaison, his unwillingness to accept the narrative that Hillson was constructing, his actions had mattered. They had created ripples that extended far beyond his personal situation. They had created change that would protect others. If this story meant something to you, if this story validated something you have experienced or feared, if this story gave you hope that accountability is possible even in systems designed to protect themselves, share it, not for clicks, not for views, but because understanding these realities, because witnessing accountability finally arrive, because seeing that it is possible to challenge authority and prevail. That matters. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. The next person pulled over unjustly. The next victim of authority abuse. The next person who tries to assert their rights in the face of power. They might have a better outcome because the precedent was set, because the federal government took notice, because accountability finally arrived in places where it had been absent. Officer Craig Hillson is in federal prison. The Oak Creek Police Department is under federal oversight. The Civilian Review Board has subpoena power. The body cameras record everything. The message has been sent. It is not perfect. but it is beginning. It is not complete, but it is a start. And sometimes a start is enough to change everything. Subscribe to our channel for more stories where the system finally catches up with those who abuse authority, where accountability prevails despite every effort to prevent it, where justice arrives for those willing to refuse to accept lies.